This computer. Excellent. Okay, I love it when things are actually working. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am so excited to be back with you here tonight for the very first session of our special September pre-high holiday series. We're so glad to have you all here. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure that you chat to everyone so we know who's with us and where you are. And also throughout the conversation, please add your questions and comments in there. We are so delighted to be able to continue gathering together from all around the world for meaningful conversation and learning and to bolster our spirits as we enter into a new year. Before we begin our conversation, I want to say just a few words about JWA for those who may be new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. These book talks are just one part of our work. I hope you will all have the chance to check out jwa.org and explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer, because there's a lot there. It is such an honor to introduce tonight's author. Dahlia Lithwick is the senior legal correspondent at Slate, a news and politics analyst at MSNBC, and the host of Amicus, Slate's award-winning bi-weekly podcast about the law. Her work has appeared in many places, including the New York Times, Harper's Magazine, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, the New Republic, Commentary, many other places. She won a 2013 National Magazine Award for her columns on the Affordable Care Act and was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in October of 2018. And I just want to say on a more personal note that, Dalia, you have served for me for the past several years, as I know you have for so many others, as a kind of ballast of justice and menshiness when the world has seemed to be spinning out of control. So thank you for that and welcome. So excited to have you here.
Oh my goodness, thank you for having me. And it's really a treat. This is my first kind of formal book talk. And it just feels like, I'm not going to show you all the RBG swag in my study, but it just feels like this is a place where like the spirit of Justice Ginsburg is like right amongst us. And it's really a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Well, we are so honored to be your first book talk. And I loved your book so much. I know that this means since we're the first book talk, it's not actually out yet. And so that means that the folks in our audience haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I want to start by saying you all should read it because it is really smart and moving and inspiring and thought-provoking. And I laughed and I cried a lot, actually, which might just be me. I'm very emotional these days, but it was just touched a lot of feelings that both were about rage, but also about hope and power and how we can work together. So I appreciated that very much. On the surface, of course, this book is about women lawyers who fought back against the threats to democracy over the last several years. And I'm not a lawyer and law isn't really my medium, but the book hit home really strongly. And I think it takes so much of those feelings of vulnerability and fear and rage that many of us have been feeling for a long time, puts it into some historical context and tells a story that also is helping to move us forward in the world. It's not an explicitly Jewish book, although I would argue that some of the framing is, and we can talk about that maybe later, and some of the women that you write about are. But it was really clear to me as soon as I started to even read about it, and certainly once I picked it up, that I would want us to talk about it here because it speaks so strongly to the work that we do at JWA. And there's some questions that you identify at the end of the first chapter. You write about the question of who is visible and who is seen and who does the work and who is remembered for the work. And those questions feel like they are essential to the work that JWA is all about. And I was curious whether those were the questions that you began with or whether they sort of emerged as you started to tell the story. Or I guess another way to phrase that is what was the seed of the book for you?
So the seed of the book for me was the book I didn't write, which everybody wanted me to write, which was just another book about RBG. And there's so many phenomenal books about her. And I think one of the sort of animating feelings as I was working through the book was that particularly after she died on Rosh Hashanah 2 years ago, the acute RBG-shaped hole in the fabric of social justice, of feminism, of how, we thought about what we wanted to be in the world. And so there was always this kind of shadow of her hanging over the book, even before she died. But then after she died, I think I wanted to do the thing that she so meticulously did every time I ever interviewed her, every time we ever spoke, which was she would painstakingly give credit to the people we'd never heard of. And she never, and by the way, Ketanji Brown Jackson, y'all may remember when she was sworn in, she talked about, Candace Baker Motley and how, I want to say it's almost a female, like, takes a village, there's never just one superhero. And the idea that one person can save us is like a uniquely American cowboyish idea. But the truth is that's not how, particularly for women, justice has worked. Justice has worked often because huge numbers of women, often Black and brown women, worked under the surface. And so I think one of the animating ideas for me was, what if I could tell the story of sort of what I thought of as like Ruth Baby Ginsburg's, right? Like, what if I could just tell the stories of 8, 9, 10 other people who, but for, a quirk of history or generation, are doing exactly the same things. It's just some of them we don't know about. And I think maybe the last thing I would say about this is I opened the book with Pauli Murray because I'm utterly obsessed with Pauli Murray. And I think Pauli Murray, I probably write this, is, the single most important legal pioneer most folks have never heard of. And if you haven't heard of her, there's an amazing documentary about her that came out last year. But Pauli Murray really went to the back of the bus 20 years before Rosa Parks and literally wrote what became the spine of the arguments in Brown v. Board of Education. Everything she did, she refused to move from a lunch counter before it was cool, kind of got no credit, often because too early, often because non-gender conforming, because Black, because everything. And so one of the things I love is that in the brief, in this sort of seminal case, Doe v. Reed, that Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued that really changed the landscape on gender equality, she credited Pauli Murray as though Pauli Murray was a co-author. And to me, that sort of generosity of, this isn't me, this is all of us. And by dint of luck or happenstance, some of us get really famous. And I wanted this to be a book that sort of exploded the idea that only the famous people are doing the work. And maybe more urgently, that if you look around, 6 Ruth Bader Ginsburgs, you really do, we all do. And I think not only is that, as I said, I think a pretty gendered model of greatness. It's certainly by necessity how we've operated, but I think it forces us to kind of grapple with this question of who gets famous and who doesn't, and what do we do about the people who didn't get famous but did all the work. And so I think that anxiety, which is exactly what you identified, is threaded through the book. And maybe I would just say as a footnote to all that, obviously a book that is kind of worshiping a bunch of women lawyers is doing a version of that. And I'm cop to the fact that there are heroes in this book, but I think that we need heroes, and we needed RBG. And so that's the seam I was walking on, was both wanting to get away from hagiography, the kind of hagiography that says, as long as I buy the mug and the tote bag and the hat, I've done my work. And to, instead of doing hagiography, just do kind of gratitude and organizing for what is all around us.
Well, I think that those, I think the challenge to the great man sort of theory of history is so important. But before we can totally undermine that, we have to add some of the great women into the story. And that necessarily not only broadens the story, but changes the story, and then also helps us think about all of the the everyday heroes in our midst, or what we at JWA like to call the ordinary extraordinary, who are, all around us. I'm also a huge fan of Pauli Murray. And I would say one of the few positive thrills of 2017 was when our shared alma mater named one of its residential colleges after her. That felt really great. And I think one of the things that we always see in our work, and especially in our oral history work, but I encounter it all the time and just talking to a lot of women in the work that I do, is that hesitance of women to acknowledge their own extraordinariness. And women so often are, you know, even the women who we know are doing incredible things will often say, oh, I don't really have a story. You need to talk to that person, you know, and I'm not really that interesting or important. This person is really the person. So I want to first of all say to all the people who are with us in this conversation, you all have stories and your stories matter. And when we take all of those stories together, which by the way is what an archive does, we see patterns and themes that change how we understand the world. And when we tell our stories together, it becomes evidence that we can change the world. And I'll get off my soapbox, but just say like, that's part of what I really loved about the book, is that it really felt like in telling those individual stories, you were showing how those were not standalone figures who, you know, operated in a vacuum, but they were actually dependent on many other people, and they were inspiring many other people, and that they were working together, even if they weren't actually working together.
Yeah, and also, you know, none of this was deliberate, but I did notice kind of on my second pass through the book that there was an arc, because we start with Sally Yates, who sort of famously refused to, as the acting attorney general in the first week of the Trump administration, to enforce the travel ban because she thought it was a Muslim ban and she thought it violated both the religious discrimination clauses in the First Amendment and also due process. And I start with Sally Yates, partly because we all know who she is. We have the mug and the t-shirt, but partly because in a way it's emblematic of, you know, this was a white woman, an incredibly privileged, you know, third generation lawyer from the South who was at the kind of top of the tree at the Justice Department, right? And so in a way it is, to the extent that there's a great man story here, it's Sally Yates. But what I tried to do as I worked through the book was to sort of have it hinge on, and there's a chapter about Vanita Gupta, who was at the leadership conference, who all she thought about was organizing and coalitions and organizing and groups and bringing people together. And then the book, I think, ends with, you know, groups of women who are working together, again, often women of color. And so whether it's Stacey Abrams and the coalitions that she formed, and she also, Stacey Abrams painstakingly name checks every single person doing the work with her, but also Nina Perales talking about the work she's doing on apportionment, just talking about huge numbers of groups of people together. And so I think in a sense, the book tracks kind of an arc where you go from your sort of standard Netflix documentary about a single hero, you know, face to the wind, braving hardship, and ends where I think we need to end in order to move forward, which is it can't be just that. And by the way, that's not how women organize anyway.
Right. Or even necessarily how the law works. And part of what you are kind of teasing out again and again throughout the book is what is the relationship between women and the law. And you have all these different ways of talking about it: a secret love affair. You say women plus law equals magic. You say something extraordinary happens when female anger and lawyering meet. So can you tell us a little bit about what you were trying to, you know, what you meant by that? Like, what is this special relationship between women and the law that you were exploring through these various characters?
I think I would say, I guess, Judith, I would say this book, partly, look, I covered the Supreme Court for 22 years. I mean, there's, you know, if I covered cellists, I might say, you know, cello and women, you know, are magic. But I started this book right around 2016, 2017, when I noticed that women were feeling two imperatives around the law, and much more acutely, I think, than men. The first was, it was women who very often when I was lecturing or speaking would come up to me and say, but how can this be legal? You know, whether it's blocking Merrick Garland for having a hearing or asking me after Trump, immediately after Trump was elected, you know, nuanced questions about the emoluments clause in the Constitution. You know, it was women who were trying to figure out how people could persistently break the law and get away with it. And I think the twin echo that I kept hearing was, if there is no law, if there is no legal architecture protecting all of us, if it's all just a bunch of norms and you can sort of buy your way out of it or bully your way out of it, women are uniquely susceptible to that. And so I think one of the things that animated, for instance, the Women's March was women really understanding and internalizing what it could mean to have somebody who's allegedly a serial sexual assailant take office. And so the book kind of starts with lock her up, right? Crowds chanting that Hillary Clinton, for the sin, which in retrospect is hilarious, of having emails on a personal server, and the unbelievable energy of crowds. And this is, at the RNC, this is huge crowds that without process or even charges wanted her to go to jail. And over the course of the Trump era, you heard that directed at AOC, you heard it directed at Nancy Pelosi. There was no one, and Christine Blasey Ford, that they weren't chanting lock her up. So I was really fascinated by the ways in which it seemed that women were understanding that the law could be weaponized against them, that the thing that was supposed to give them the vote and allow them to have credit cards and to have jobs and all the protections we thought we had was actually pretty flimsy. But undergirding that was this terrifying possibility of using the law to punish women. And so the book kind of troublingly, and I'm just, here's the spoiler, it ends on a pretty sad note, only because Dobbs had just come down, reversing Roe. But it seemed to me the almost perfect symmetry of lock her up as deployed against Hillary Clinton, and then women in the wake of Dobbs being jailed for miscarriages, being charged criminally for using drugs while pregnant, that we suddenly catapulted into this world where lock her up wasn't a threat anymore. It was an actual reality. And I hesitate to say, but we are seeing that more and more. If folks didn't see the story from Alabama yesterday about women who are being incarcerated for months at a time to keep them from using drugs while pregnant. And I think that we really, as women, lived on that seam between understanding that the law is what makes us free and the law could take it all away. And so for me, that complicated relationship meant that women really clung to law. We don't have violence on our side. We're not the ones who are, shooting up schools. We're not, by and large, the ones who were storming the Capitol. What we have is law. And in a sense, when it's at its best, it really does make us equal and does make us powerful. At its worst, and again, you really see this in just the language around women right now and harming women, that at its worst, it could be deployed to harm us. And I think that the book, in a sense, wants to hold on to that first vision, that if we lash ourselves deeply to the rule of law, to meaningful courts, to the possibility of voting, then I think we can make ourselves free. But we have to be just so careful at this turn we took so quickly this past June into the law as something that makes women much less free and in fact makes them really susceptible to danger. I don't know if that's fully responsive, but I think that's the line I was dancing on.
Yeah, and I think you do a great job of showing how the people that you write about are living with that kind of, I want to say ambivalence. I don't know if that's quite the right word, all the time. And I think that's also part of what makes it not in the great man mold, because you show their vulnerability in sort of recognizing that they're not sure that they can always make law do what it's supposed to do, but they also recognize it's probably their best bet. And so there's so much of that grappling. I mean, each of the people that you write about is grappling with that question of like, can the master's tools, to use Audre Lorde's expression, dismantle the master's house? And they all have slightly different takes on it, although because they're in the law, presumably they believe at least somewhat that it can, or they hope that it can. Do you put yourself in that camp as well?
I do. I mean, I very much associate myself with the optimists in this book. I think Anita Hill is the person who says it most cogently toward the end of the book. And, Professor Hill has every reason to say, this entire system for all of history was predicated against not just women, but Black women. I didn't have a chance. And yet she's the one who most strongly, I think, gives this clarion call for there isn't another thing. There's not something better. I often say kind of cynically, if the law is allowed to fail, plan B is, the army. I mean, that's how this works. And, some of the, like, one of my favorite characters in this book for sure is Becca Heller. And she is kind of the first front of fighting the Muslim ban. And she's really clear that she just thinks, lawyers are dumb and law is dumb, and that, the whole thing is so hopelessly corrupt. And if she could just, fight it out on the streets, she probably would, because it's unfixable. But I probably, again, as somebody who, right this week, I'm looking at a court that set aside the entire FBI investigation of the president on an insane pretext and completely implausible theory of executive power. I'm looking at a court yesterday that tried to pull apart the Affordable Care Act because he wasn't able to do it the first time. Judges are really scary right now, and some judges are much scarier than all of the judges that I've seen in my lifetime covering the court. But I think most judges are still trying to do good work. They are trying to be fair. I think Nina Perales in her chapter, and she talks about one person, one vote and apportionment. And she says, like, she really sees judges struggling to get there. And that while we live in a world where, I think she says they want to see punch you in the face, discrimination, it's hard to show that. But I think she really feels pretty sanguine about the fact that for the most part, the system holds. And for the most part, the system acquits itself really well. And I think I'm there in large measure because, as I said, I don't know what we have if we don't have rule of law. And what I fear is that if we don't have rule of law, the first casualties will be the vulnerable people. It will be women and people of color and children.
Yeah. In terms of the relationship between women and the law, one of the things that you also say, I think pretty explicitly in the book, is not an essentialist argument about women's sort of special spidey powers about the law, but that, based on the ways in which the law has not always worked for women and people of color and other vulnerable populations, that women and others have a particularly good, they're often good at kind of sniffing out when things are going wrong, and can therefore recognize it and speak it before others might be willing to acknowledge it.
I have been obsessed, particularly because I cover the Supreme Court, with this foundational question almost since the beginning of my career, which is, do women judges judge differently? And I've written about it a bunch of times, and I, in fact, almost wrote a book about it, except I sort of felt with an N of 3 justices on the Supreme Court, I didn't want to do the essentializing you're describing. But one of the things I did see, and I do see, is what you just described, which is I think that women are almost always by necessity living in two worlds. They're code switching all the time. And you really see it. I see it particularly among Justices Sotomayor and Kagan. I see it in Justice Jackson. I saw it in Justice Ginsburg and Justice O'Connor all the time, where they're inhabiting this man's world, frequently at the sufferance of the men around them. But they're also living in this other world, the way they grew up, the way they were educated, how they were treated in law school, all the million ways that each of them describes sitting in conference and saying a thing and having everyone ignore it. And then a guy says it 10 minutes later and everyone's like, that's brilliant, Justice Rehnquist. Like, they all lived that. And so I think in a way, there is this sort of very thin film between those two worlds for them. And they pass through it over and over again every day in their work. And I actually would say, I'm tempted to say that ended with Justice Ginsburg and Justice O'Connor, but it's not true. I really see that also in the way that the 3 current liberal justices carry themselves. And we should talk about Amy Coney Barrett, because that's a kind of a different story. But I think that there's simply a willingness to understand that you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And I always think of Justice Ginsburg when she, at the end of Chief Justice Rehnquist's career, when he was her Chief Justice and she adored him and they disagreed on everything. And at the end of his career, right before he died, and he was a reliable, far right conservative on all matters. And then he wrote this opinion in the Family Medical Leave Act case, where it was this transcendent understanding of women's lives and the hardship of caring for someone when you're also working. I mean, it was so beautiful. And in fact, Justice Ginsburg used to tell the story that after he read the draft opinion, her husband said, Ruthie, did you write this? Like, thought she ghostwritten it for him because it was so generous in its understanding of a woman's life. And she always told the story by way of saying, you know, when Chief Justice Rehnquist was writing that opinion, he had a daughter who was suddenly a single mom, who was juggling kids, who was like, would drop the kids in his chambers sometimes because she had to, I mean, he just got to see what he didn't know in the world about the lived life of a woman who's got a job and kids. And it absolutely infuses the opinion. And she used to always use it as a story, not just about allyship, but about how you can learn what you don't know. And I think that in just a million ways, women are always aware of what they don't know or what they're not allowed to know or what they're not allowed to say. And it's so different just to posit the way Justice Alito writes the opinion in Dobbs when he reverses Roe, where he's like, don't care about women's health, don't much care about women's equality, don't much care about how this will impact anybody on the ground. Organize and go vote. Sorry about the vote, by the way. And, you know, best of luck to you. I'm citing a witch burner. And the utter myopic failure to see how women are affected, how this changes everything, I think is a thing that is much harder to pull off if you're a woman.
Yeah. There you have this great line in the book about how representation isn't just about optics, it's also about experience and history. And I thought that was so important and isn't said enough. We talk all the time at JWA also about, like, you know, if you can see it, you can be it, and how important it is to see people inhabiting certain roles and the impact of that. But of course, it's not just that. That's just the like starting point or the icing on the cake. It's really about, like, once people are in roles and they are bringing their own lived experience and able to actually incorporate that and share it, and it changes everything. It changes what people can imagine and what the whole conversation is. And that's the piece that is ultimately, you know, going to bring about the change.
Well, and it's, first of all, it's such a sort of hat tip to JWA, because I think it is the work that you do when you say to women, tell your stories, like every one of your stories is a piece of this. And again, you know, I always felt like I was living in a natural experiment of this, because I would watch the court operate. And one of my all-time favorite oral arguments that changed the way I thought about everything was a kind of awful case involving a strip search of a teenage girl in high school. And her parents weren't notified. They were looking for the dreaded drug ibuprofen that she was allegedly peddling. And they, like, you know, patted her down and made her shake out her bra. And, you know, it was awful. School officials, and she sued. And it was fascinating because the oral argument in the case absolutely started as a kind of Porky's, you know, ha ha, isn't this hilarious? And the justices were, you know, at some point Justice Scalia made some crack about, did they start searching from the inside out or the outside in? And then Justice Breyer made this, like, typically Breyer kind of joke about, when I was getting changed for gym class, people stuck stuff in my underwear all the time. Like, what? It was in every piece of it was insane. But then there was this moment where Justice Ginsburg was just like, stop. Like, this is stop. Like, this is a child who's traumatized. Being a 14-year-old girl who's strip searched is really different from being a 14-year-old boy in gym class. And she was so mad. And it was the other thing that was fascinating, just on your theme of telling stories. Everybody walked out, all the reporters walked out. And the people who wrote the stories that night that were like, holy hell, that was appalling. Joan Biskupik, Nina Totenberg, you know, I wrote one. I mean, the women were just like, I don't know what you did not see happening in there. Mm-hmm. And so the most interesting part of that story is that Justice Ginsburg flipped their votes. I mean, they changed their votes. They voted for the student. And it's because I think not just that you tell your story and that you're brave enough to tell it and to say you have no idea what it's like to be a 14-year-old girl being searched by school authorities, but that they listen. And
Mhm.
that's the piece of it that I think we forget, particularly in a world where nobody listens anymore.
Right.
But we have an obligation to sort of tell our stories, in part because sometimes people really just don't know.
Right. Well, and I think part of the tension that you also write about that's related to this is what the relationship is between law and culture change. Like, how does change actually happen? And obviously, the law is part of that and is a really essential piece, but it can't be the only part, because you can have a law. I think you give the example of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which addressed sexual harassment, but there was no culture to sort of support people bringing those cases, or if they were bringing the cases, to, notice that people were bringing the cases and talk about it in those ways. And as someone, again, who like identifies with that piece of the work of culture change, which, as you're saying, is just fundamentally about telling and hearing different kinds of stories. It was really interesting to hear people who you're writing about who are like, they're all in on the law, but also recognizing like there has to be social change, doesn't happen just from the law. And there has to be this other piece of the work that is happening at the same time.
It's so interesting because one of the most interesting interviews I had in this book was talking to Anita Hill. And I spoke to her not long after Christine Blasey Ford. And I thought she'd be much more furious that, all these years had passed and nothing had changed. And she comes out saying exactly what you just said. In fact, when I was testifying in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, nobody even knew what sexual harassment was. I mean, they essentially thought unless he, physically assaulted her, it wasn't harassment. And they certainly couldn't understand. I mean, none of the senators, including on the Dem side, could comprehend why she didn't complain that night if it happened. Why did you wait all these years? And she is really at pains to say, with Christine Blasey Ford, that didn't happen. Nobody said, or nobody who was trying to parse what was true said, oh, well, that's all he did. That's just hijinks. People didn't say, oh, she kept it a secret for a really long time. People understood what sexual harassment was, what power dynamics are, what shame is. And so I think she really felt like the culture change was massive. And if you look at the polling, everyone believed Christine Blasey Ford. Nobody believed Anita Hill. That isn't because Blasey Ford was a better witness or, it was that culture had allowed certainly women, but actually many, 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 many millions of men to say, oh, this actually is not okay. And so for her, the moral of the story isn't, oh my God, it's Groundhog Day, the exact same thing happened. It's that all those women who stood behind Dr. Ford in their Handmaid's Tale gowns and who, shouted at Jeff Flake in the elevator about, their own assaults, they didn't show up for Anita Hill. And I think that she sees that as a huge, profound culture shift. Obviously, it's not enough. And it doesn't work without a process, an adjudication process that bolsters that. But I think her feeling is this story isn't nearly as Groundhog Day as we want to believe.
I would like to believe that. I mean, I appreciate having that perspective, and it is amazing to hear it from Anita Hill. And it's also, it gets back to that question of like, how can the law, so how do we get the law to be enough? And you write in the book about both the Me Too movement and about the Kavanaugh hearing in personal terms as well, in terms of your own kind of reckoning with what it means to work within a system and have experiences and talk about them or not talk about them and make decisions about what you're going to do based on that. Do you want to share a little bit about your thoughts about that now?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's so weird about this book is that I really am loath to write about myself ever. And I try as much as I can to be the dispassionate reporter. But swept up in this book is the weirdest year of my life, which it begins with Nazi marches in my hometown in Charlottesville that we witnessed all summer. And then I guess I Me Too'd a federal judge who stepped down, and then Kavanaugh. Like, all of this happens in a really, really truncated amount of time. And every piece of that, because it was personal to me, because it did. I mean, if you've actually had people with flaming torches walking in your town saying blood and soil, you know, back to the ovens, it's really hard to have a robust, trusting relationship with the law, particularly when the police don't show up to protect the synagogue. And by the same token, you know, it's just very, very hard to look at the Supreme Court as this sort of oracular balls and strikes calling institution that I covered, even when I disagreed, but covered with great reverence and regard for the institution. Once you've seen Christine Blasey Ford testify seemingly very truthfully, and then Brett Kavanaugh, you know, threatening and shouting and banging the table and saying, you know, we're going to reap the whirlwind. So each of those things is really destabilizing. And in some sense, this book is a protracted piece of therapy, as you've identified, for what do you do when you're in love with the law and it feels as though it's not showing up for you time and time again. And I guess it loops a little bit back to your opening question, which is, what do you do when you have that ambivalence? And that is certainly threaded through the book. I think for me, what I want desperately is for every woman who is furious about Dobbs to understand that's a systems problem, that's a law problem. For every person who is furious about partisan political gerrymandering that can't be fixed, that's a systems problem. For everyone who is mad about the fact that 70% of the country wants gun control and the Supreme Court basically just put weapons into the hands of everybody on the New York subway, that's a systems problem. And so I think that it's not that I've given up on the rule of law or courts or lawyers, but each of those institutions has been so deeply warped by, you know, we can talk about the malapportioned Senate and we can talk about, you know, Trump judges in the Federalist Society, but those systems are not recognizable to me anymore. And so what I think the work is, and it's why the last 3 chapters of the book are about voting as much as they are about law, because the two things can't be decoupled in my view. And I think if we don't, each of us say, the Senate has to be fixed, the Electoral College is wildly, wildly distorting of popular opinion. You know, the Supreme Court is about to hear an absolutely bone-chilling case about giving state legislatures unreviewable powers to set elections. This is all stuff that is not the stuff of law. This is the stuff of broken law. And I think that every one of those things I just mentioned is fixable, but it's absolutely not severable from how furious you are about guns and abortion. And so I think that's the answer. These are systems problems. These are process problems. We don't talk about gerrymandering nearly enough. But if we don't talk about those things, the other stuff doesn't get solved. It just comes in a black robe, but it's not law.
Right. Well, and I think I really appreciated your personal grappling and putting your own story in there, because I think it also was part of what you were describing in each of the people that you were writing about, which is that everyone has to figure out, like, what are their lines and what are the ways that they can acknowledge what's broken, but also like show up in good faith and feel like they're part of the solution in the right, you know, in the way that works for them. And how much of that is an individual question. And that's part of what I think is interesting in looking at the span of people that you write about is, you know, everyone has their own answer to that. And that's good, because we need people working on it from different angles. And some people are going to say, like, I'm all in with the law. And some people are going to say, actually, it's organizing that is going to be the thing. And some people are going to say, I need to be reporting from inside the courtroom. And some people are going to say, right now, for me, that's not right. You know, and it's all of those approaches coming together that make a movement ultimately.
I think that's true. And I think maybe I would fold into that. My single biggest critique, and I say this as a Supreme Court reporter who, by the way, I think I have the best beat in the world. I think there's no press corps that can like hold a dim candle to the Supreme Court press corps. But I think the way we cover cases is really dangerous, because we tend to cover them, you know, at the beginning of the term, we say, these are the 6 blockbusters, and we fly down to Atlanta and we, you know, interview the plaintiffs. Dobbs was one of 10 horrible decisions this year, but we only focused on Dobbs. By the same token, I think that you can say like, oh, we won. So Whole Women's Health, right? The 2016, the big abortion win right before the election. We thought like, okay, it's over. We fixed abortion, right? We won at the court, and my God, we got Anthony Kennedy on board. This is, a banner day. And nobody went down to see that all those Texas clinics that had closed because of the law couldn't reopen, right? That it was almost impossible, even after quote unquote winning, to get an abortion in Texas. And so I think we're very, and it goes back to your great man question, we're very focused on telling a crisp, clear, kind of binary story about wins and losses and who prevailed. And I always thought if I could invent a beat, it would be law as like a linear progression over decades. I want to cover when the Supreme Court said, okay, we're doing away with, some of the busing cases in the Seattle Parents Against case. What happened? Nobody knows. It was a huge case. But what happened 5 years later? What happened 10 years later? And I think that one of our mistakes, and I sort of say this to be responsive to your point about having to pull from all threads, like I think that we get so hepped up that we just won X or we lost Y, that we don't notice that underneath the surface, the EPA got eviscerated this year. Underneath the surface, a coach was allowed to pray on the 50-yard line after a football game, coercing his students to do that. And the court thought that that was his private decision. A woman's private decision about her body is not private. So all this stuff is happening en masse. You have to look at it together. And I completely cop to the fact that it's an immense amount of stuff to keep track of. And even as a court reporter, I can't. But I think to look at these things seriatim, or to look at them in isolation and say like, well, we won 7 and lost 3, is to not see how deeply, deeply changes in the landscape affect all of us, and we missed it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And also that, the case isn't about winning or losing. It's ultimately about how the law is going to, like how people are going to live it, how people are going to live with the law, and how that plays out. And if you don't follow up, you don't know. And that's the whole piece about like, it's not just about the law being on the books. It has to be lived in a particular way. I want to go back to Charlottesville, which you mentioned in passing, but I think is both a really important chapter in the book, but also a really important part of the story to put in here, which maybe wouldn't seem obvious to be part of this book. And also it's one of the chapters that you write from both a legal perspective and as a longtime resident of Charlottesville who was living there at the time. So from the personal perspective. So what was it like to, first of all, to try to write that and to live it? And, how did that filter into all of the work that you do, which wasn't, necessarily focusing on Charlottesville, but happened to be what you were living at the time?
A couple things. I think the first was, that was the year I realized that I wasn't a hysterical Cassandra at all. Like that was the year where I spent most of that summer saying to anyone who didn't live in Charlottesville, we had the Klan, we had the Proud Boys, we had more Proud Boys, we had another Klan, and then we had, August 12th, and anybody could see this was going to explode. And everyone in town would say, this is going to be really bad. I couldn't convince my editors at Slate that this was a story until quite literally there were helicopters and drones. And it's a way in which, and again, I'm going to say something essentialist and you can check me, but I felt like my Jewish spidey senses recognized every piece of this. And it wasn't trivial to me that the synagogue couldn't get enough protection. It wasn't trivial to me that the Black community was saying over and over and over again, we can't win this because if we go out on the streets and fight them, our sons are going to be arrested. We can't stay at home because they're Nazis and Klansmen in our town. And that sense, I think, that this catastrophic thing was coming and nobody saw it coming plays out again on January 6th. So when my kids watching, in Zoom school, what was happening on January 6th, came downstairs, the thing they both said to me was like, this is just Charlottesville again. It's the same people, they're doing the same stuff. The police are standing down, or the police are just completely ill prepared. I think there's a way in which, and again, I do feel, I often say, you know, as somebody whose grandparents on every side came from a country with like a book and a candlestick, like we know this is in our muscle memory. And so for me, it was both, you know, the insanity of, you know, what Trump was inflaming and refusing to call it out, and having, you know, people in his immediate surroundings saying, you know, you have to say like Nazis are bad, and he wouldn't. But I think it was also, in addition to a political story, it was a story about frogs in pots for me, which really feels like a very deeply Jewish story. You stay and you stay and you think you're fine and you think you're fine, and then you're not fine. And it's just a thin, razor thin line. And I guess the other thing I would say, and this is the depressing thing, is once that has happened, once it's your synagogue, right? And the Torah scroll that was secreted out of the synagogue and hidden in a congregant's home was a Holocaust scroll. So like once that happens, I don't know that you ever feel perfectly safe again. And so for me, one of the reasons to include the Charlottesville story was, you know, because I felt as though January 6th, I was the one person who wasn't surprised. Right. And also, and this is really important, and I want folks to hear me, because it ends with this absolutely just shellacking victory in court, right? So Robbie Kaplan and Karen Dunn bring a suit that didn't actually get to happen until this November. But they got an amazing, amazing judgment against the white supremacists and the Nazis who came to town. And nobody seemed to notice that either. And it was like, this should have been, in my view, you know, the trial of the century. And it also kind of didn't get reckoned with. And so for me, what's important is that was a massive win. That was a bunch of, you know, Chris Cantwell and Richard Spencer. I mean, those guys are still to this day tweeting, you know, death threats at Robbie Kaplan. And yet she prevailed in a court using the sort of rule of law to do it. It's an amazing, triumphal story about the system working. And I don't know why we didn't tell that story a lot louder than we did.
Yeah. And you have her asking in the chapter, like, how do I do my job when I'm a Jew sitting next to a Holocaust denier, right? And like that question, I feel like, is also one that you have to sit with, of just like how, and I think it's true in all different ways for the people that in the book, sort of like, how do you show up as yourself with your vulnerabilities, with the like enormous dissonance that many of us live with in the world today, and like keep showing up and doing your work. And it's not an obvious answer. It's not an easy answer. And, but to hear the question called, I think is really, really important.
Well, and it's again, you know, I think it's one of those things where there's a reason that Robbie Kaplan, who was famous for doing the Edie Windsor suit that became the, you know, the end of the Defense of Marriage Act that became Obergefell marriage equality. I mean, Robbie's not a civil rights attorney. This is not her thing. And the day after Heather Heyer was killed, she was on the phone saying, find me some plaintiffs, I'm going to sue some Nazis. And Karen Dunn also, you know, equally just all the spidey senses going. And so I think it is like into the breach, the people who run in kind of recklessly are often the people who are most vulnerable to what they just saw happen. And I think Robbie's chapter ends where she's quoting her wife's, I think somebody who descended, her wife was descended from, who was one of those people who said, the Nazis aren't going to be that bad. Let's just sort of stick around because they don't mean it. They'll settle in and be normal. And I think her point is that not that we have to be hyper vigilant or that, you know, we're the only victims. It's none of that. But it's that we have to be sensitive where the folks around us are trying to normalize or downplay. We have to jump in because we remember collectively, even if it's just our muscle memory, about the candlesticks in the book.
Right. And also that's part of how organizing happens, is that like vulnerability and being able to acknowledge a sense of powerlessness becomes a power that you can draw on to connect with people, to do the work, to organize, and that's part of what needs to be happening to actually do the social change piece of things.
I think that's right. And I think it's not an accident that so many of the folks in this book, whether it's Bridget Amiri, who's defending, migrant teens at the border who are being denied reproductive care, or Becca Heller, who's helping these Iraqi refugees who are literally circling the skies and they can't get off their planes because the Muslim ban has come into effect. So many of them tap into their own vulnerability and talk really openly about, what it's like as a woman, or what it's like, Becca talks about, trying to sort of show authoritative leadership in the immigrants' rights community when she's this 35-year-old kid who doesn't even think she actually has a law license, and trying to say, no, but I think I'm right about this. And so they're all struggling both with the vulnerability of the folks they're protecting, but like so poignantly with their own. And I love that they're so open about it, because again, I don't know that you get that many great man stories where people say, dude, I was standing in front of that court and I just had no idea what I was doing there. But I also think it's so resonant for all of us who sort of struggle with our imposter syndromes to realize that if you can think through that line between their vulnerability and yours, it's so much easier to be brave.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of those like gifts that women can give. I have been ignoring a little bit the chat, and I apologize. And it's only because there's so much I want to talk to you about this book, but there has been a little debate going on in the chat about RBG and her decision not to retire. Do you have any thoughts you want to share with us about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the question I'm asked most often. I can tell you two versions of the answer. One of which is she felt very strongly that Sandra Day O'Connor had been forced off the court, because she was. Sandra Day O'Connor went to, and this is all reported by Jan Crawford, went to Chief Justice Rehnquist when Justice Rehnquist was already dying of thyroid cancer, went to him and said, my husband is increasingly sick and I'm going to want to take better care of him. This is, again, no male justice ever retires to take care of their spouse. And she said, I will go next year because the court frowns on having 2 retirements in 1 year. And he, again, dying of thyroid cancer, said, no, I'm going to go next year. You go now. And within 6 months, and she did, she retired, and then he died a few months later. So we had our 2 vacancies that summer. But over and above that, within a year, her husband had to be institutionalized. And then she spent years, quite literally, being, trying to do civics work and other things, but having left, I think, under duress. And also watching, her entire jurisprudence, because she had been the swing justice, crumbling, right, on affirmative action, on church state. I mean, every issue that she had been the deciding vote, Justice Alito dismantles. So that was what Justice Ginsburg was watching. And I think she, not unreasonably, felt that nobody was going to force her off the court. And that, by the way, nobody said to Justice Stevens, it's time you retire, right? And he was older. And so I think she dug in on that. I add no value judgment to that. I just think like that context is useful because she saw it happen to a cherished person who then spent years wishing she'd stayed on the court. The other thing, and this I have heard her say, and she said it to me, is that if people wanted to have a court that looked like the court they wanted, they should have showed up and voted for the court in 2016. Mm-hmm. And her view was, this isn't on me, because by a 2-to-1 margin, every single person who said the court was the most important voting issue for them broke for Donald Trump. And we haven't talked much about religion and the ways in which Donald Trump really said to the evangelical community and the Catholics, like, you're going to hate me and you're going to vote for me because I'm getting Roe overturned. And they absolutely pulled the lever for him. And I just want to say, like, to my great shame, that a lot of progressives either didn't like her, they didn't love her, they decided, but her emails, whatever it was, but they had 2 octogenarians, a 79-year-old, and a vacancy that had been held open That was what was on the table when they didn't go and vote in 2016.
Right.
And one other edge to that is that fall, when the seat had been held open already for 6 months, Ted Cruz was out stumping for the Senate, John McCain stumping for the Senate, Chuck Grassley asking and saying explicitly to voters, if Hillary Clinton wins this election, we will hold that seat open for 4 years or 8 years. They are not going to seat someone. And Democrats running for the Senate said nothing, didn't campaign on it, didn't make it an issue. And so I think that there's a slight unfairness in centering the court and centering RBG in 2021 and not centering the court in 2016 when we could have done something about it. I think in some sense, the reason I'm a little pedantic about this is this is the theory of the book. It's not on her, it's on us. And we blew it. And it's not to say that she didn't make the wrong call. And of course, history now shows she did make the wrong call. I think her feeling was, this is the thing that you get out and vote on. And if we didn't, and we didn't, that's on us.
Yeah. Well, with that forward thinking approach, what should we be paying attention to in the coming months, especially as I don't even know, especially as the world is totally nuts?
I mean, I would say two things. One is all of the polling shows that women are there. And even the most recent polling last week from the Wall Street Journal of all places says that women are activated, they're angry, they're voting, they're registering, right? Every single piece of data we have is that women are registering in these unbelievable numbers. Just today, the Michigan Supreme Court allowed a ballot initiative onto the ballot that's going to do the same thing that happened in Kansas, right? When people are allowed to vote, women's rights always triumph. We are not invisible. We might be invisible to Sam Alito. We are not invisible yet to the law. And so the first thing is we've got to harness that, and we have to figure out really how to do it in 2 months. And it's a huge challenge, but my sense is that there is a groundswell of support for what happened in Kansas and what's going to happen in Michigan. So that's the first part. And I guess the other thing is, and this is the kind of grim piece of it, the court is going to hear a really seminal and I would say catastrophic voting rights case, the independent state legislature case, which is the Harper case. But they're also hearing gerrymandering cases. They're hearing a pile of voting rights cases. So I think one of the things we have to do is understand that the same Supreme Court that is taking away our rights is taking away the ability to vote and rectify it. And whether that's Shelby County, whether that's Brnovich, whether that's Citizens United pouring dark money into the system, that's the court making it harder for us to be seen. And I think that's the thing we have to do, is understand, as I said at the beginning, the rule of law works as long as it's still a democracy, but we really, truly have to fight for that now.
Well, thank you so much, Dalia, for this conversation, for your book, for being out there in the trenches, holding up a vision of justice and reminding us both of the ways that we're falling short and that we're not alone and that we're not powerless and we all have our work cut out for us to do. So, thank you for that message. And you write in the conclusion about women, you say, we hear things, we see things, we are awake. And I am holding on to that as my intention for the new year, to bear witness, and importantly, to do it collectively. And that's part of what we're trying to do at JWA too. So thank you, Dalia, and thank all of you in the room for being part of this work. It is essential that we're doing it. Everybody, please buy and read this book. It makes a great gift. As always, there's more you can explore at JWA as well. You can learn about some of the precursors to the women in this book, people like Bella Abzug and Bessie Margolin and Harriet Pilpel and Phyllis Kravitch. Sonia Pressman Fuentes was with us. I saw her name in the chat. She's also amazing. You can listen to our podcast episode with Rebecca Traister, who comes up frequently in the book, on the power of women's anger. You can read the beautiful piece that Dalia wrote for us on Ruth Bader Ginsburg in our We Remember collection of memorials to RBG. Also want to remind people, this is just the first in our 3-part September series. So please join us next week to hear from Letty Cotton Pogrebin, feminist pioneer, co-founder of Ms. Magazine. in conversation with me about her memoir, her new memoir, Shonda. That is going to be a hybrid event. So if you happen to be in the Boston area, you are invited, welcome to join us in person at TBZ, Temple Beth Zion, which happens to be my synagogue in Brookline, starting at 7 p.m. for a book signing, 8 p.m. as usual for the program. And you can register for the in-person program on our site and at the link that we just dropped in the chat. And the following week on September 22nd, please join us for a conversation with Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg about her book on repentance and repair, Making Amends in an Unapologetic World, which is also perfect for this season of repentance. So thank you all again. Thank you, Dalia. And until next week, everyone be well and take good care. Good night. Okay.